The Secret History of the Imperial Security Bureau, Agents of Order. Chapter 1. Origins of the ISB. The fall of the Galactic Republic was not merely a political transformation. It was the quiet death of 1,000 freedoms. With Order 66 and the Jedi Purge marking the collapse of resistance, the galaxy shifted overnight from a democratic structure to an authoritarian regime, cloaked in the robes of security. From the ashes of the Republic, Emperor Palpatine erected his new order, and with it came a need not just for military dominance, but for absolute loyalty. To ensure such obedience, the Emperor authorized the formation of the ISB, the Imperial Security Bureau. The ISB was never meant to be just another branch of military enforcement. It was, at its core, a tool of ideological purification. Its stated mission was to safeguard the security of the Empire from threats both external and internal. But beneath that official doctrine lay a deeper, more insidious truth. The ISB existed to root out dissent, ensure loyalty to the Emperor, and shape the very thoughts of Imperial citizens. The genesis of the Bureau. In the immediate wake of the Clone Wars, Palpatine knew that fear alone would not be enough to hold the galaxy together. Stormtroopers and Star Destroyers could occupy space, but fear of rebellion, of even the faintest whisper of resistance, required something more meticulous. The ISB filled that void. It was built upon the bones of the Republic's own security forces, primarily the Senate Bureau of Intelligence, the Republic Judicial Department, and other covert operations divisions. Many of its first recruits were veterans of Republic intelligence. Others came from the judiciary or from planetary security forces, hand-picked for their zeal, ambition, and unwavering loyalty to the new order. But more important than where they came from was how they were shaped. The ISB was not just about training agents, it was about indoctrination. It was said that every ISB officer was molded into an extension of the Emperor's will. Their armor was suspicion. Their weapon was fear. Their doctrine was simple. The Empire is stability, dissent is chaos. Wolf Yularen and the rise of bureaucratic power. One of the most recognizable figures in the ISB's early years was Colonel Wolf Yularen. Once an admiral in the Republic Navy, Yularen had served with distinction during the Clone Wars and had earned the Emperor's trust. With a voice steeped in calm authority, he was appointed as one of the founding directors of the ISB. Unlike the brutal overseers who would later rise through the ranks, Yularen saw the ISB as a necessary evil. He believed in law, order, and the stability of the Empire, but he also believed in professionalism and restraint. This put him at odds with more ruthless elements of the Bureau, and although he held power, he often walked a delicate line between enforcing loyalty and avoiding becoming a tyrant himself. Yularen's presence aboard the Death Star was no coincidence. The ISB saw the superweapon as not merely a military tool, but as the ultimate enforcement mechanism. Its capacity to destroy worlds was the ultimate deterrent, and the Bureau's agents were deeply embedded in the project to monitor loyalty and suppress knowledge leaks. Shadows within shadows. Even as it expanded, the ISB faced internal challenges. It operated alongside the feared Imperial Intelligence Division, an older and more secretive agency responsible for espionage and counter-espionage. Though their missions sometimes overlapped, their philosophies clashed. Imperial Intelligence favored subterfuge, manipulation, and pragmatism. The ISB favored ideology, control, and loyalty at all costs. This rivalry would define much of the Empire's internal politics. Both reported directly to the Emperor, but the ISB quickly gained favor by becoming a kind of political priesthood for the new order. They would investigate and interrogate not just rebels, but military officers, senators, governors, anyone whose loyalty was deemed questionable. To be questioned by the ISB was a fate worse than battle. To be watched by them, a mark of suspicion. To be cleared by them, a sign that you had been broken, or that you had given them someone else to break. suppressing the spark of rebellion. As whispers of rebellion began to emerge, on Ryloth, Lothal and countless Outer Rim worlds, the ISB expanded rapidly. Its early agents were deployed to root out underground cells, infiltrate activist groups and control the flow of information. They weren't just military minds, they were psychological strategists, propagandists and interrogators. Entire academies were established to train agents in techniques ranging from loyalty profiling to cultural subversion. They learned how to manipulate planetary governments, co-opt media channels, and rewrite history. The goal was not simply to suppress the truth, but to ensure that truth no longer had meaning. On Lothal, ISB agents were instrumental in dismantling the early cells of what would become the Phoenix Squadron. On Coruscant, they hunted down remaining Jedi sympathizers. On Alderaan, they maintained a close eye on the royal family, though they failed to uncover Princess Leia's deep ties to the rebellion before the planet's annihilation. A machine without a heart. The ISB was not built to inspire hope, but to destroy it. Its officers were faceless, often clad in pristine white or stark black uniforms. They carried no rank insignia, their authority superseding traditional military structure. An ISB agent could walk into a starship command bridge and override a captain. They could commandeer fleets, seize data, and order executions, all in the name of security. But in gaining such power, they became something else. The ISB was not an agency of warriors, it was an agency of fear, built to crush not just rebellion, but identity. Citizens were taught to report one another, teachers were monitored for subversive speech, children were encouraged to denounce their parents. Palpatine's brilliance was in making the Empire not just a tyranny of force, but a tyranny of the mind. And the ISB was his scalpel. Chapter 2: Structure and Divisions. The ISB was not a monolith, though to the average citizen it may have seemed so. It was in fact a vast and meticulously organized machine, its many cogs interlocked, designed to root out weakness, suppress rebellion, and maintain the illusion of unity across a fractured and fearful galaxy. At its core, the ISB functioned as both a secret police force and a political watchdog, and its internal architecture reflected this dual purpose. To understand how the ISB operated, one must look beneath the surface, into the divisions, the hierarchy, and the silent war it waged, not only against the Empire's enemies, but within its own ranks. The branches of order. The ISB was divided into several specialized divisions, each engineered for a specific function in the Empire's doctrine of control. These divisions operated independently in some respects, but often overlapped, collaborating or competing, for dominance in their shared mission of Imperial Security. Surveillance Division. The lifeblood of the ISB's intelligence operations flowed through the Surveillance Division. It was this branch that deployed agents to watch civilian populations, monitor planetary communications, and infiltrate all levels of Imperial infrastructure. But, in essence, Herodotus reflected all infrastructure within, from orbiting satellites to localized probe droids and holonet interception towers. The Surveillance Division had eyes and ears everywhere. They maintained constant feeds from security outposts, intercepted messages, flagged subversive keywords, and built complex loyalty profiles on billions of citizens. No conversation was private, no encryption was safe. The Surveillance Division's motto, "We see what you hide," was not a boast, it was a promise. Enforcement Division. Where the Surveillance Division watched, the Enforcement Division acted. These agents were often the most visible face of the ISB, dressed in stark uniforms, armed with sidearms and authorization codes that trumped local law enforcement and even military command. Their tasks ranged from conducting raids and arrests to overseeing military officers suspected of treason. On starships, they had full authority to override chain of command. On planets, they could dissolve local governance with a signature. Their greatest weapon was not the blaster, but the fear of what would follow after they arrived. The Enforcement Division also coordinated with stormtrooper units trained specifically for urban pacification and crowd control. This marriage of surveillance and force ensured that once suspicion was confirmed, suppression was swift and absolute. Internal Affairs Division. Perhaps the most feared of all the ISB branches was Internal Affairs, a division not aimed at the public, but at the Empire itself. Internal Affairs policed the military, the Senate, the governors, and even other ISB operatives. This branch was responsible for rooting out corruption, treason, and what it called ideological drift, any deviation from the Emperor's vision of order. If a fleet commander questioned an order, if a Moff displayed empathy, if an agent of another division grew too curious, Internal Affairs was deployed. Their agents operated anonymously. Some never revealed their identities to the very officers they judged, and when they did, it was often too late for the accused. Loyalty Division. The Loyalty Division worked in subtler ways. It did not punish, it conditioned. This division crafted propaganda, organized public rallies, monitored school curricula, and managed the Empire's vast network of re-education centers. They understood that lasting control required more than force. It required belief. So they reshaped the truth. They rewrote history. They made heroes out of tyrants and villains out of freedom fighters. At the heart of the Loyalty Division's doctrine was the concept of compliance through admiration. Make them love the Empire, and they will fear betraying it. Re-education and Rehabilitation Branch. When fear and force failed, the re-education branch began its work. Through intensive psychological manipulation, sensory deprivation, and deep conditioning, they aimed to convert dissenters into model citizens. Subjects were shown carefully constructed holograms of imperial glory, subjected to auditory loops of pro-empire rhetoric, and administered neural stimulants that triggered emotional responses to visual cues. Some broke, others were reshaped. A reconditioned citizen would often return to their home not even aware of their treatment, but their friends would notice something off. Their words felt rehearsed, their smiles too wide, their loyalty unquestionable. The hierarchy of control. At the top of the ISB's hierarchy stood the Director of Imperial Security, a shadowy position that rarely made public appearances. Beneath them were sector supervisors who oversaw entire regions of the galaxy, and below them field operatives, assigned to planetary or system-specific roles. Unlike the rigid structure of the Imperial military, the ISB thrived on fluid authority. Rank was not always an indicator of power. Information, loyalty, and usefulness were the true currencies. An agent with actionable intelligence on a Moff's betrayal could wield more influence than a colonel with decades of service. This fluid power structure was intentional. It bred competition, it fostered paranoia, and it ensured that only the most loyal or the most ruthless rose through the ranks. The ISB and the Emperor's ear. The ISB answered to no department, no Senate committee, no overseer. Its only true master was Emperor Palpatine himself. Through back channels and encrypted holocoms, agents filed reports that bypassed traditional command structures and went straight to Coruscant. This direct line to the Emperor elevated the ISB above reproach. It allowed them to override military directives, to neutralize governors, to suppress information that might damage the Empire's image, and it made them deeply hated. The Navy saw them as parasites, governors saw them as leeches, but no one dared say so aloud, because to say it was to be heard, and if one was heard, one might be watched, and if one was watched, one might disappear. The bureaucracy of fear. What made the ISB truly dangerous was not just its divisions or its weapons, but its omnipresence in imperial life. Citizens filled out loyalty surveys in public places. Children pledged allegiance daily in schools. Every workplace had an ISB liaison, no matter how minor. Fear became normalized. People whispered in cafes. They smiled at officers with hollow eyes. They reported their neighbors for things they did not understand, because to report was to be safe, and to question was to be noticed. The ISB didn't just enforce the law, they were the law. A state within a state, a shadow behind every door. Chapter 3. Life inside the Bureau. From the outside, the ISB appeared clinical, efficient, mechanical, and devoid of emotion. Its agents walked corridors with measured steps, their uniforms pristine, their faces unreadable. But within the Bureau's reinforced walls and silent offices, a very different reality took shape. Life inside the ISB was a relentless crucible, one where ambition, paranoia, and ideology wove a tapestry of quiet terror. To serve the ISB was not a job, it was a transformation, becoming an instrument of order. The path to becoming an ISB agent began with selection, not recruitment. Citizens did not apply to the Bureau, they were chosen. Often identified in youth, potential candidates were profiled by behavioral algorithms, flagged during educational screenings, or referred by military instructors. Traits favored by the ISB included obedience, discipline, psychological endurance, and, above all, unwavering loyalty to the Empire. Once selected, candidates were moved into one of several shadowed academies located throughout the core worlds. These facilities, known only by code designations such as Facility 27, Fort Resilience, or Blackridge Hall, were isolated, heavily secured, and sealed off from the wider galaxy. Training spanned years. Physical drills were intense but not the focus. Psychological endurance, memory conditioning, emotional suppression, and loyalty testing formed the heart of the curriculum. Instructors played mind games with cadets, engineered betrayal scenarios, simulated interrogations, and manufactured ethical crises. You did not graduate the academy because you succeeded, you graduated because you became someone who could not fail. The ritual of silence. Communication within the ISB was precise, minimal, and laden with meaning. Words could be weapons, but also liabilities. Agents were taught to speak in terms of objectives, protocols, and verified data. Emotions were signs of weakness. Friendships were vulnerabilities. Trust was a liability. Each agent was assigned a case officer, a handler who oversaw their progress, filed psychological reports, and administered regular loyalty evaluations. These handlers could themselves be rotated or removed without warning, reinforcing the idea that within the ISB, nothing was permanent but the mission. Most agents lived in isolated quarters, whether aboard Imperial installations or planetary command centers. Their housing was uniform and undecorated. Personal expression was discouraged. All things were utilitarian, replaceable. And they themselves were no different. The faces of the Bureau. Despite this dehumanizing rigor, the ISB did produce legends, agents whose ruthlessness, intelligence, or unwavering execution of the Emperor's will made them infamous, even within the Empire itself. Agent Alexander Callus, a cold and calculating figure, began his career in the Enforcement Division. Known for his work suppressing uprisings and hunting Jedi survivors, he became a symbol of the Bureau's hand in the Outer Rim. He later defected to the Rebellion, a betrayal that sent shockwaves through the ISB and led to sweeping reforms in their psychological screening protocols. Supervisor Grandian, whose true name remains classified, led the Loyalty Division during the height of the Galactic Civil War. A master manipulator, Grandian pioneered mass indoctrination programs on industrial worlds. It was said that entire cities would cheer the Empire in the morning, and by night, half of them would be in ISB custody, smiling still. Colonel Wolf Yularin, the Bureau's most public face, became a symbol of its reach. A former admiral turned ideologue, Yularin operated aboard the first Death Star as part of its internal oversight apparatus. His presence was not merely symbolic. He ensured that the Death Star's commanders remained loyal not to Tarkin, but to the Emperor alone. These figures walked the knife's edge between duty and fear. Some believed in what they did, others simply feared what would happen if they failed. The burden of omnipresence. Life as an ISB agent meant being everywhere, and yet nowhere. You observed others, but were observed yourself. Your mission was surveillance, but your life was under constant watch. Every word, every action, every hesitation could be recorded and reviewed. The ISB maintained a tiered clearance system. Even among agents, secrets were compartmentalized. You might work alongside a fellow officer for years and never learn their true assignment. There were rumors of agents who didn't even know their real names, only code names and objectives. Field assignments were issued without warning. You could be stationed on Coruscant 1 week, then embedded on a distant Outer Rim world the next. You might be asked to impersonate a civilian, a governor's aide, a rebel sympathizer, whatever the Bureau required. And when your mission was over, you would vanish as easily as you had arrived. Paranoia as a virtue. The greatest danger inside the ISB was not failure, it was being suspected of it. The Bureau encouraged internal reporting, anonymous tips, unsolicited observations. Even the act of not reporting something could be seen as suspicious. This bred a culture of fear. Agents became adept at hiding even harmless details of their lives. They sanitized their conversations, avoided expressing opinion, and stayed relentlessly neutral. To survive in the Bureau was to become a ghost with a badge. There were whispered stories of agents who disappeared not during assignments, but during routine meetings or after submitting a standard report, their quarters sealed, their names erased from rosters, their records marked classified. No one asked what happened, everyone understood. Faith in the Emperor. Despite its ruthless internal culture, many ISB agents truly believed in their mission. The galaxy was chaotic, the Republic had failed, the Jedi had betrayed order. Only the Empire, through absolute control, could bring peace. They saw themselves not as villains, but as guardians. They believed their sacrifices, their isolation, and their discipline held the galaxy together. Without them, entire sectors would fall to rebellion, corruption, or alien infiltration. This belief was the fuel that kept the Bureau running, the silent flame behind every midnight raid, the cold purpose in every interrogation room. The ISB was not just a bureaucracy, it was a faith in fear, a faith in order, a faith in the Emperor. And like all faiths born in shadow, it demanded sacrifice. Chapter 4. The ISB, the Rebellion. The rise of the Rebel Alliance did not happen in a single moment. It was a slow burn across the stars, sparked in dark alleys, ignited in backroom meetings, and fueled by the pain of worlds forgotten by the Empire. While the Imperial Navy engaged the rebellion in open battle, and the Army occupied insurgent systems, it was the ISB that waged the silent war, a war of shadows, minds, and loyalty. To the ISB, the rebellion was not just a military threat, it was a virus, a sickness that infected loyalty, questioned order, and promised hope where the Empire demanded obedience. And the ISB's mission was to identify, isolate, and eliminate every trace of that infection, mapping the insurgency. Long before the rebellion coalesced into a unified military front, the ISB had already begun cataloguing signs of resistance. Its surveillance division created intricate profiles on suspected sympathizers, senators, merchants, educators, even former clone troopers. Entire sectors were red-flagged for subversive tendencies, especially in the mid-rim and outer rim territories. Using a blend of intercepted communications, undercover informants, and planetary loyalty indexes, the ISB charted an expanding web of unrest. Every leaflet, whispered complaint, or missing datapad became evidence in a larger picture, the beginning of organized resistance. Some worlds were deemed ideologically unstable. On these planets, like Lothal, Ryloth, and Garol, the ISB embedded itself deeply. It placed agents within local administrations, seized control of broadcast stations, and operated black site detention centers under the guise of civilian security offices. The goal was not only to destroy the rebellion's infrastructure, but to prevent its story from ever being told. Infiltration and counterinsurgency. Unlike the imperial military, which relied on overwhelming force, the ISB specialized in infiltration. Operatives posing as sympathizers or smugglers embedded themselves within rebel cells. These agents, often working alone, gathered intelligence, manipulated alliances, and triggered internal collapses. One of the Bureau's greatest infiltrators was Agent Tierney, who operated extensively in the core and mid-rim during the early days of the Civil War. Her work dismantled several key rebel communication networks and led to the capture of dozens of early alliance strategists. Field agents were trained in counterinsurgency techniques, identifying leadership structures, decoding local slang and symbols, and dismantling trust through targeted arrests. Sometimes the ISB allowed rebel cells to grow just enough to lure in higher-level operatives before striking. There were also cases where the ISB fabricated entire rebel cells to trap dissidents. These false flags, known as construct cells, served to expose sympathizers and justify harsh military action. Torture by design. Interrogation was a dark art within the ISB. The Bureau rejected blunt torture in favor of precision psychological dissection. The enforcement and re-education divisions employed interrogation droids equipped with neural disruptors, truth serums, and sensory deprivation fields. However, the most effective tool was often a well-trained officer. These agents studied everything about their subject: personal history, fears, values. They would use guilt, manipulation, even fabricated recordings of loved ones in distress to break resistance. A rebel might enter an ISB facility full of fire and defiance. Days later, they would emerge calm, glassy-eyed and obedient. Or they wouldn't emerge at all. One infamous site was Facility 831 on the moon of Lothal. There, dozens of captured rebel agents were processed, reconditioned, or executed. Survivors spoke of endless corridors, cold light, and the ever-present hum of machines designed not to kill, but to unmake you. The battle for local. Lutho became a case study in ISB failure and the dangers of underestimating insurgent cells. Despite a strong ISB presence and surveillance grid, the planet became a hub for rebel activity. Local sympathies, corrupt officials, and supply chains allowed the Phoenix cell to establish a base of operations under the Bureau's nose. Supervisor Arienda Price, who had previously aligned closely with ISB enforcement, called for military assistance from Grand Admiral Thrawn. While Thrawn's involvement increased the pressure, it also highlighted the limits of ISB doctrine. Precision and surveillance could not always overcome the power of popular rebellion backed by faith and sacrifice. The liberation of Lothal dealt a psychological blow to the ISB. It marked the first time an occupied world was freed by rebel action without external military intervention. The Bureau responded with intensified crackdowns across nearby systems, issuing sector-wide loyalty purges and doubling recruitment into surveillance squads. But the fire had already spread. The problem of the Senate. While the rebellion grew in shadow, the Imperial Senate remained a battlefield of decorum. Many senators, like Bail Organa and Mon Mothma, openly voiced concerns about the erosion of civil liberties. The ISB was not blind to these voices, but Palpatine forbade open arrests for fear of political instability. Instead, the Bureau watched. Senators were monitored constantly, their staff were profiled, meetings were recorded and analyzed, travel off-world required ISB clearance. The Bureau even went so far as to bug diplomatic transport vessels and consular buildings. When Mon Mothma publicly denounced the Emperor and fled into open rebellion, the ISB moved swiftly to discredit her. They distributed false evidence of treason, fabricated testimonies, and erased favorable media coverage across the holonet. But it was too late. The public had heard her voice. The Senate was soon dissolved entirely, eliminating the last internal check on the Bureau's power. Operation Firebreak. One of the Bureau's darkest initiatives was Operation Firebreak. Approved in the aftermath of escalating rebel victories, Firebreak authorized the preemptive elimination of suspected sympathizers. Even if no actionable proof existed, entire families were arrested, entire townships razed. On Mirror Prime, over 1,000 citizens vanished in a single night after a rebel broadcast was traced to the planet's eastern range. No trial, no statement. Just silence. The ISB viewed Firebreak as tragic but necessary, a hard firewall against ideological contagion. But for many in the galaxy, it was the moment they realized the Empire would never protect them, only control them. And from that moment forward, recruitment to the rebellion surged. A war without glory. Unlike the Navy or the Army, the ISB did not win medals or stand on victory platforms. Its victories were invisible, its failures catastrophic. An agent's success meant no one ever knew they were there. Their legacy was silence. But when the rebellion grew strong enough to strike openly at Scarif, at Yavin, at Endor, the ISB found itself increasingly reactive. It could no longer contain the threat with silence and shadows. The galaxy had awakened. Truth had become louder than fear. Still, the Bureau did not falter. Until the Emperor's last breath, it hunted the rebellion, and even after his death, pockets of ISB agents continued the fight, clinging to a shattered ideology, enforcing an order that no longer existed. Chapter 5. The Politics of Fear. If the blaster was the Empire's fist, and the Death Star its sword, then fear was its breath, the invisible force that filled the lungs of 1 billion systems and made them bow. The ISB was the chief architect of this fear, not through brute violence alone, but through silence, uncertainty, and omnipresence. Its power was not in what people saw, but what they imagined. To understand how the ISB maintained control over the citizens of the Empire, one must look beyond prisons and patrols. The real battleground was the mind. The true war was psychological. The doctrine of control. The ISB operated under a guiding principle. Fear is loyalty made manifest. Where love for the Empire failed, fear would compensate. People would not die for the Emperor, but they would obey him, if they feared what happened when they didn't. The Bureau did not need to arrest everyone who spoke out. It only needed to arrest one person, loudly, publicly, without warning. The rest would silence themselves. This created a culture of self-regulation. Entire neighborhoods became extensions of the ISB's will. Citizens policed each other. Teachers censored themselves. Children repeated slogans without understanding. Every whisper could be reported. Every silence could be suspicious. Even those who had done nothing wrong lived as though they had. Propaganda as policy. The Loyalty Division of the ISB oversaw one of the largest propaganda campaigns in galactic history. It controlled HoloNet programming, approved public education curricula, and maintained an endless stream of pro-imperial messages across billboards, transport hubs, and even menus in civilian canteens. Posters of stormtroopers saluting children, holograms of the Emperor speaking of unity and peace, an animated series depicting rebels as savage terrorists were standard fare. Every world had its own variation of the message, adapted for local culture, language, and values, but always centralized, always uniform in intent. Truth became malleable. History books were rewritten to minimize the Jedi, glorify the Clone Wars as a necessary purge, and frame the Republic's collapse as a deliverance from chaos. In this climate, memory itself became a weapon. Those who remembered differently became enemies of the state. The disappearance machine. Perhaps the most feared tool of the ISB was the simplest, disappearance. Without trial or announcement, a neighbor, a co-worker, a spouse could vanish. One day present, the next a blank space in conversation, a sealed apartment, an echo where a name once lived. These vanishings were usually the work of enforcement division teams, authorized to extract and relocate individuals deemed ideologically dangerous. In truth, many were simply people who had said the wrong thing, looked the wrong way, or knew something they shouldn't. Once taken, these individuals were either subjected to re-education, indefinite detention, or, more often, never seen again. But it was not the act that mattered. It was the fear of it. That anyone could vanish made everyone complicit. It forced the population to become an extension of the ISB. And in the Empire, complicity was survival. To tales from occupied worlds. Across the galaxy, the ISB left scars, both visible and unseen. On Ferrix, a once thriving industrial world, the Bureau operated a reconditioning center disguised as a trade regulation bureau. Citizens entered for interviews about missing cargo or broken labor quotas. Some never returned. Those who did were changed, compliant, hollow-eyed, and unfailingly loyal. On Onderon, political activists found themselves invited to state-sponsored events where they were filmed praising the Empire. Days later, those videos aired on public holonet screens, proof of Imperial unity. What viewers didn't know was that the activists had spoken under threat, with family members held in undisclosed locations. On Gorman, following a peaceful protest against Imperial tariffs, the ISB authorized a crackdown that turned violent. Footage was suppressed, witnesses silenced, and the incident reframed as a rebel attack on civilians. The truth became classified, and the dead forgotten. Officially. These weren't exceptions, they were policy. The Citizen Watch program. One of the Bureau's most insidious tactics was the Citizen Watch program. Introduced as a community defense initiative, it encouraged ordinary people to report suspicious behavior. Anonymous drop boxes appeared in cities. Civilian liaisons were appointed to local ISB outposts. At first, the program targeted known criminals or rebel sympathizers, but soon it widened. A comment made in jest, a friend who stopped attending Imperial Day parades, a worker who questioned a news report. Rewards were given for useful tips, food vouchers, job promotions, priority housing, but even false reports had value. They flooded the system, made everyone suspect, and overwhelmed the innocent with fear. Over time, whole communities fractured. Friends stopped trusting each other, families broke under surveillance. The Empire no longer needed to divide people. They divided themselves. The paradox of power. The ISB wielded immense power, but it was power built on fragile foundations. Fear could control a population, but it could not inspire. It could silence dissent, but not erase it. Some agents began to question the cost, quietly, internally. A few tried to implement reform, less punitive strategies, more data-driven approaches. Most of them were reassigned, or worse. One senior officer, Supervisor Markless JN, attempted to establish a civilian feedback bureau to measure citizen morale. Within weeks, his department was absorbed into internal affairs. His name vanished from the records. The ISB could not allow nuance. It could not tolerate complexity. Its strength was in being monolithic. And so it remained inflexible, even as the cracks began to show. The spectre of rebellion. Ironically, the ISB's reach often produced the very thing it sought to destroy. On worlds where the Bureau cracked down hardest, resistance grew, not always militarily, but spiritually, in stories, in graffiti, in stolen moments of defiance. The more the ISB tightened its grip, the more the stars began to slip through its fingers. And yet, even in its final days, the Bureau remained devoted to its doctrine. As the Death Star fell, as rebel fleets pierced the Imperial blockade, as the Emperor was cast into legend, the ISB whispered into comlinks, tapped keys in dark rooms, and prepared the next wave of enforcement. Because to them, rebellion was not a cause, it was a symptom, and the Empire would not die not so long as fear endured. Chapter 6. The ISB and Imperial Intelligence. While the galaxy trembled beneath the Empire's heel, a quieter war raged behind closed doors, unseen, unspoken, and lethal. It was not fought with fleets or sabers, but with dossiers, whispered accusations, and carefully timed failures. At the heart of this silent conflict stood two of the Empire's most powerful instruments, the ISB and Imperial Intelligence. Though both agencies ostensibly served the same master, the Emperor, they embodied opposing philosophies. One enforced control through loyalty and fear. The other manipulated truth through secrecy and deception, and as their missions overlapped, so too did their ambitions, leading to one of the most enduring rivalries in Imperial history. Twin shadows. To the uninitiated, the ISB and Imperial Intelligence seemed identical. Both wore muted uniforms, both operated outside traditional military structures, both wielded immense authority, but their core ideologies clashed like oil and water. The ISB believed in purity of purpose. Its agents operated in the light, visible, feared, and publicly unquestioned. They enforced ideological loyalty and demanded conformity. For the ISB, power came from order and surveillance. Imperial Intelligence, by contrast, believed in utility of secrets. It thrived in the shadows, crafting double agents, manipulating enemy movements, and engineering long-term operations. For intelligence, power came from chaos and manipulation. This fundamental difference created friction that was not just philosophical, it was fatal. Divisions at war. Within the Empire, each agency had carved out territory. The ISB controlled internal affairs, civilian loyalty programs, planetary surveillance and propaganda. Imperial Intelligence handled external threats, rebel infiltration, foreign espionage, and long-range sabotage operations. But the line was never clear. If a rebel cell operated on a mid-rim world, was that an internal threat or an external enemy? If a senator was leaking information, was that a loyalty issue or a foreign breach? If a governor grew too powerful, who would bring them down? Too often, both agencies answered, "We will." This led to duplication of missions, contradictory orders, and sometimes catastrophic overlaps. One notable incident involved a rebel courier on the planet Katria who was being tracked by both ISB enforcement and an intelligence black ops team. The result, a live operation compromised, 5 Imperial agents dead, and the courier escaped. Neither agency took responsibility. Case study: the fall of Director Krennic. One of the most high-profile casualties of this rivalry was Director Orson Krennic, head of the Death Star project. Though technically a military officer, Krennic relied heavily on support from Imperial Intelligence to protect his secrets and navigate the political minefields surrounding the battle station's construction. However, as rumors of instability and resource mismanagement spread, the ISB launched a quiet investigation into Krennic's loyalty. Surveillance officers compiled reports on missed deadlines, unauthorized transfers, and suspicious conversations with alien labor overseers. Eventually, a dossier reached the Emperor himself, framing Krennic as too ambitious, too reckless, and dangerously self-serving. Whether the allegations were true or simply manufactured is irrelevant. What mattered was that the ISB moved first, and Krennic's fate was sealed. This was not uncommon. Both agencies learned that in the court of the Emperor, the best way to survive was to eliminate your rivals before they eliminated you. Agent on agent. Though interagency cooperation existed on paper, in practice it was rare. When ISB and intelligence operatives were forced to work together, tensions simmered beneath the surface. ISB officers considered intelligence agents untrustworthy, too free with deception, too willing to compromise ethics for results. Intelligence operatives, in turn, saw ISB agents as blunt instruments, too rigid, too ideologically driven, and too visible. There were whispers of agents sabotaging each other's missions, leaking false intelligence, and even assassinating one another during joint operations. None of these incidents were ever officially acknowledged, but they were understood. In the shadows of the Empire, even allies were threats. The Emperor's game. Emperor Palpatine was no fool. He wanted these agencies to compete. By encouraging rivalry, he ensured neither grew too powerful. He pitted them against one another deliberately, often granting overlapping orders, redundant missions, and conflicting mandates. This fostered a climate of fear and ambition that mirrored the Sith philosophy itself: power through conflict, strength through survival. Some historians argue that the Emperor maintained control not by preventing civil war, but by fragmenting it. The ISB and Imperial Intelligence became mirrors of his dual nature, one enforcing control, the other spreading chaos. And neither could destroy the other without losing the Emperor's favor. It was a dangerous balance, but an effective one. Diverging legacies. As the rebellion grew stronger, both agencies were forced to adapt. The ISB increased its direct involvement in planetary operations, tightening its grip on civilian life. Imperial Intelligence, meanwhile, shifted to desperate sabotage operations, some so aggressive they bordered on terrorism. At the time of the Battle of Endor, the rivalry had begun to unravel. Intelligence agents, fearing post-war purges, began destroying records, vanishing into the Outer Rim. ISB operatives launched internal purges, arresting anyone suspected of treason, even within their own ranks. The Emperor's death broke the last thread holding the rivalry in check. Without his guiding hand, both agencies spiraled into chaos. Some turned on each other. Others fled. A few, loyal to the core, carried on their missions. Alone, directionless, and forgotten. The cost of compartmentalization. In the end, the rivalry between the ISB and Imperial Intelligence may have weakened the Empire more than any rebel strike. Educated missions, missed intelligence, internal sabotage. These fractures cost the Empire vital ground in its war. While Star Destroyers clashed with rebel fleets, the Empire's eyes and ears fought amongst themselves. What was meant to be a network of total control became a web of secrets, lies, and mistrust. And as the Empire fell, no one wept for the loss of either. Because in a regime built on fear and deception, the truth had become the enemy long before the rebellion ever fired a shot. Chapter 7. Surveillance State. Tools of Control. To rule a galaxy is to see it, not merely its stars and systems, but its people, thoughts, and movements. The Empire understood this, and so did the ISB. For all the fear it inspired with uniforms and arrests, the Bureau's greatest strength lay in its ability to watch, to observe without being seen, to listen without revealing it was listening. This chapter peels back the metal curtain to expose the eyes and ears of the ISB, the tools, technologies, and tactics that built the greatest surveillance state the galaxy had ever known. Watching the galaxy. The ISB knew that fear alone could not sustain order. Fear had to be reinforced with certainty, the certainty that one was always being watched, that every message, movement, and moment might be recorded, analyzed, and judged. To this end, the Bureau deployed a vast network of surveillance assets. Orbiting satellites, urban data towers, interceptor droids, and planetary surveillance grids created a lattice of omnipresent observation. In metropolitan worlds like Coruscant, Corellia, nearly every square meter of public space was under constant audio-visual surveillance. Traffic cameras were linked to central ISB nodes, crowd-monitoring drones hovered above marketplaces, facial recognition scans operated silently in the background of every major transportation hub. But what truly set the ISB apart was not just that they watched, it was how efficiently they did it. The data mines. Surveillance alone is meaningless without analysis. To process the sheer volume of data collected daily across the Empire, the ISB developed what it called deep access algorithms. These systems parsed holocalls, financial transactions, shipment logs, and movement patterns for anomalies, flags that might suggest seditious behavior and behavior. Keywords were prioritized: Jedi, rebellion, corruption, traitor, and hundreds of others in every major galactic language. When uttered, they triggered red flags. But the ISB's systems went further. They used predictive behavioral modeling, cross-referencing data against known dissident profiles to detect threats before they emerged. This wasn't just surveillance, it was pre-crime detection. Entire citizen files, known as loyalty dossiers, were stored in high-security databanks. Every Imperial citizen had one. These files included work performance, educational background, religious affiliations, psychological assessments, and even records of interpersonal relationships. If someone began distancing themselves from Imperial institutions, associating with undesirable individuals, or showing signs of ideological drift, the system alerted the ISB. Sometimes before the person even knew they had changed. HoloNet monitoring and information suppression. The HoloNet, once a bastion of free communication during the Republic era, became a carefully monitored and restricted space under the ISB's control. While citizens believed they were accessing news freely, nearly all content was curated, rewritten, or delayed by HoloNet security divisions under ISB jurisdiction. Live events were rarely truly live. Time delays allowed analysts to filter feeds, cut seditious content, and replace genuine footage with Bureau-approved programming. Independent broadcasters were either absorbed, silenced, or exposed as rebel fronts. Encrypted communications between civilians were banned. Even innocuous personal messages could be flagged if they included forbidden phrases or suspicious attachments. Private conversations ceased to exist in the galaxy. And most terrifying of all, many forgot it ever had: droid eyes and listening walls. The ISB deployed specialized droids equipped with high-frequency microphones, long-range scanners, and stealth capabilities to monitor everything from political speeches to alleyway arguments. Some models were small enough to perch unnoticed inside ventilation grates or behind wall panels. Others walked among the public in plain sight, disguised as sanitation droids, repair units, or protocol assistants. These listening units were calibrated to pick up vocal stress, detect elevated cortisol levels, and flag subversive tonal inflection. Buildings constructed during the height of Imperial expansion often included listening walls, thin layers of sensor material built into the infrastructure itself. These walls absorbed conversation and body heat signatures, transmitting them wirelessly to ISB monitoring hubs. In short, the Empire had turned the very architecture of civilization into an instrument of surveillance. Biological profiling. Beyond droids and data, the ISB advanced into the realm of biological analysis. Citizens were required to submit DNA profiles, retina scans, and neural signatures during standard registration protocols. This data was used to identify individuals not just by appearance, but by genetic footprint and brainwave patterns. Rumors persisted of projects in which the ISB developed emotion detectors, devices capable of detecting fear, anger, or ideological excitement through subtle physiological cues. Though their existence remains unconfirmed, many high-security installations required daily biometric check-ins that assessed mood as well as identity. It was not enough to act loyal. One had to feel it. Informant networks. Technology had its limits. In response, the ISB created and nurtured vast informant networks across every major sector. Shopkeepers, transport workers, school administrators, and labor foremen were all potential sources. Some were paid, others blackmailed. Many volunteered either out of loyalty or fear. Informants received training in observation, questioning, and secret communication. A simple nod, a code-phrasing conversation, or a dropped datapad could initiate a report. These networks penetrated every layer of society, and because no one knew who among them was informing, trust collapsed. Communities broke down, social bonds decayed, isolation became safety. In the Empire, your best friend might be the one who didn't report you. Real-world echoes. The part of a fictional galaxy, the ISB's surveillance state, echoes chilling real-world practices. Its methods mirror those used by totalitarian regimes on Earth. Stasi files, facial recognition, state informant programs, and weaponized media control. The lesson is universal. When fear drives policy and control eclipses freedom, technology ceases to serve the people. It serves the state. And once that transformation is complete, even the truth itself becomes suspect. The illusion of peace. For many citizens, the ISB's surveillance created a fragile sense of peace. Crime dropped in monitored sectors. Public disorder became rare. Streets were clean, orderly, and silent. But beneath that stillness was tension. The tension of knowing you were never alone, that somewhere, someone might be watching, that every breath, every blink, every slip of the tongue could bring a knock at the door. It was a peace bought not with justice, but with submission. A peace that would one day shatter. Chapter 8. High-profile operations and scandals. While much of the ISB's power lay in the shadows, there were moments, piercing flashes, when the Bureau's work became unmistakably visible. These moments, often controversial, sometimes catastrophic, revealed the full extent of the ISB's reach and ruthlessness. They exposed the cost of absolute control and the chaos that simmered beneath its polished surface. This chapter explores those rare but revealing moments when the ISB's veil lifted through infamous operations, internal cover-ups and scandals that shook even the heart of the Empire. The Antilles interrogation incident. One of the most notorious episodes involving the ISB was the interrogation of Captain Remus Antilles, a loyal Alderaanian officer who served under Princess Leia Organa aboard the Tantive IV. When Darth Vader captured the vessel above Tatooine, Antilles was brought in for questioning regarding the stolen Death Star plans. Officially, Vader was responsible for the interrogation and execution of Antilles. Unofficially, reports suggest the ISB had already flagged Antilles for observation due to his proximity to high-level rebel activity. His loyalty dossier had been updated multiple times in the weeks prior to his death. Leaked files, later found in a Coruscant archive vault, revealed that the ISB had intercepted several encrypted communications from Leia's ship, but failed to decode them. The Bureau's embarrassment over this intelligence failure led to retroactive justification of Antilles' death and a purge of local ISB analysts involved in the monitoring. This was not merely the elimination of a rebel suspect, it was damage control, brutal, decisive, and silent. The Kintan uprising and civilian suppression. On the outer rim world of Kintan, protests began as small demonstrations against Imperial labor quotas. Within days, they escalated into full-blown riots after a known rebel agent broadcast footage of ISB agents detaining children for re-education under the Loyalty Division's Youth Compliance Program. The Bureau responded with overwhelming force. Dozens of agents were deployed alongside shock troopers. Civilian communications were cut. Buildings housing protest leaders were vaporized from orbit. Entire neighborhoods were sealed off and their populations relocated. The suppression worked, but at a cost. Footage leaked through smuggler networks and was broadcast by rebel propaganda channels across the galaxy. The ISB's methods, once secret, were now visible to billions. Rather than deny involvement, the Bureau doubled down, framing the operation as a necessary intervention to restore peace. Internally, the fallout was brutal. Several regional supervisors were demoted or reassigned. The agent who approved the orbital strike vanished within a month. Klein Ben Compton became a cautionary tale within the ISB. Victory, if not contained, could be as dangerous as failure. Senate infiltration and the organ affair. While the Senate was still operational, the ISB operated an elite subdivision dedicated to monitoring high-ranking officials for signs of ideological disloyalty. This was never more evident than during what would become known as the organ affair. After years of tracking Senator Bail Organa of Alderaan, the ISB assembled a case alleging he had provided resources to known rebel groups. Despite pressure from within the Bureau to move on this intelligence, Emperor Palpatine blocked any direct action. Organa's arrest would cause political turmoil and potentially fracture the fragile illusion of democratic legitimacy. Instead, the ISB initiated Operation Grey Flame, a covert effort to destroy Organa's credibility. Agents planted false financial records, orchestrated scandals involving off-world humanitarian funds, and even attempted to frame him for conspiring with separatist holdouts. Organa weathered the storm, and the Bureau failed to break him. But the attempt poisoned the political atmosphere. Trust between senators fractured, friendships dissolved under suspicion. The ISB hadn't brought down Organa, but they had weakened the Senate itself. Soon after, the Emperor disbanded the legislative body altogether. The Death Star cover-up. After the destruction of the first Death Star at Yavin, the Empire scrambled to control the narrative. The loss of the battle station and the lives of over 1 million personnel aboard it was a monumental blow. The ISB was tasked with shaping the truth. The Bureau declared the incident a strategic redeployment failure and blamed rogue engineers, internal sabotage, and even local planetary corruption. Entire departments within the Death Star's command structure were retroactively declared traitors, most of whom had died in the explosion and could not defend themselves. Holonet records were scrubbed. Family members of those aboard the Death Star were told their loved ones had died in classified service. No names were released, no memorials held. The ISB even distributed falsified battle footage implying that the Death Star had been destroyed while neutralizing a catastrophic alien threat, an effort to redirect fear away from the rebellion and toward fabricated external enemies. But among the ranks of the Navy and Army, the truth was known, and so was the Bureau's role in silencing it. Operation Cinder. Perhaps the most horrifying ISB-lugged event occurred after the Emperor's death. As part of a pre-programmed contingency, Operation Cinder was enacted by loyal remnants of the Empire. The directive rained destruction upon Imperial worlds to punish them for failing to protect their Emperor. The ISB enforced Cinder with unwavering brutality. On worlds like Vardos, agents ensured that local governors carried out orbital strikes against their own people. Civilians who resisted were arrested or executed. Protests were treated as treason. This operation exposed the core truth of the Bureau. Loyalty was not to the Empire's citizens nor even to its ideals, but to the Emperor alone. Without him, everything was ash. The ISB became a self-consuming force, enforcing policies even its agents could barely comprehend. Some defected in horror, others obeyed with grim resignation. A few, like Agent Iden Versio, ultimately broke ranks and joined the New Republic. Operation Cinder marked the beginning of the end for the ISB. It revealed the Bureau's ultimate flaw, not its ruthlessness, but its obedience to a dead god. Scandal, silence, and collapse. As the Empire fractured, the ISB tried to hold it together. They intensified loyalty screenings, increased surveillance, and initiated mass arrests of anyone suspected of New Republic sympathies. But it was too late. Scandals erupted, classified reports were leaked, former agents turned informants. The Holonet broadcast images of detention centers, reconditioning chambers, and vanished senators. For the first time, the galaxy saw the ISB not as protectors of order, but as the machinery of tyranny. And that machinery, exposed to the light, began to rust. Chapter 9. The Fall of the ISB. No empire lasts forever, not even one built on fear. As the second Death Star burned over Endor and the Emperor fell into myth, the machine that had bound the galaxy in silence began to fracture. Stormtroopers hesitated, Star Destroyers drifted, governors fled, and at the center of it all, the ISB, the ever-watching eye of the Empire, began to blink. The fall of the ISB was not sudden. It was a slow, splintering collapse. Its agents continued to operate, its offices remained staffed, but the invisible threads that had once held everything together were unraveling. Without the Emperor, the Bureau lost more than its leader. It lost its purpose. A machine without a master. The ISB had never existed for the sake of order alone. It had been the Emperor's will extended across the stars. His doctrine of loyalty, obedience, and fear shaped every protocol, every surveillance node, every interrogation room. But with his death, the ideological foundation of the ISB cracked. While the Navy and Army still had chain-of-command structures and physical weaponry to lean on, the ISB relied on something more fragile: belief. Belief in the necessity of control. Belief in the unity of the Empire. Belief that the system would always endure. And suddenly, those beliefs were gone. Some agents refused to accept the truth. They carried on as if nothing had changed, continuing arrests and surveillance, clinging to routine. Others took matters into their own hands, executing local traitors, silencing critics, and burning records in preparation for a resistance that never arrived. Still more simply walked away. The fragmentation. Without centralized leadership, the ISB fractured into regional factions. Some declared themselves independent enforcers of imperial justice. Others offered their services to warlords, ex-governors, or former moffs who claimed power in the vacuum. A few sold classified data to the highest bidder: rebels, pirates, or black market information brokers. On an axis, ISB agents turned the local branch into a brutal fortress state, purging dissenters and declaring martial law. On Garel, they disarmed and surrendered peacefully to New Republic forces, providing intelligence in exchange for amnesty. On Eridu, a massive internal firefight broke out between rival factions of the Bureau, each claiming to be the true continuation of Imperial security. The once pristine order of the ISB dissolved into chaos. The hunt for the architects. The New Republic, recognizing the threat posed by surviving ISB agents, launched targeted operations to dismantle the Bureau's remnants. Special task forces were assigned to track down supervisors, interrogators, and loyalty officers responsible for wartime atrocities. Many were captured and put on trial. Some were executed, others escaped into obscurity. Colonel Ularen, the Bureau's most public face, had perished aboard the first Death Star. His death spared him the fate of many of his colleagues. But others, like Supervisor Granin, went underground, reprogramming their identities, erasing biometric data, and disappearing into the chaos of the post-war galaxy. Whispers persisted of ISB cells still operating in the shadows, manipulating local politics or assassinating defectors. While some of these stories were fabricated, others were very real. The tools of the Bureau had not vanished, they had simply changed hands. The Archive Purge. Perhaps the greatest act of self-destruction came in the form of Directive 19Z Zeta, a final fail-safe protocol embedded deep within ISB systems. If the Emperor died and the Empire fell into disarray, the Bureau was to initiate a mass purge of sensitive data to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. The result was catastrophic. Entire data cores were wiped. Loyalty dossiers, surveillance footage, interrogation transcripts all gone. Decades of intelligence vanished overnight. Millions of Imperial citizens lost their records, some clearing them of guilt, others erasing their crimes. The New Republic was denied critical information, but so were the remnants of the ISB itself. Without its archives, the Bureau could no longer police the past, and without the past, the present slipped through its fingers. Post-Endor holdouts. Even after the Battle of Endor and later the Battle of Jakku, a handful of ISB agents continued to operate. These individuals, sometimes called ghosts, wandered the galaxy enforcing Imperial justice as they saw fit. Some targeted New Republic officials for assassination. Others attempted to restart surveillance networks using outdated tech and loyal informants. Most were hunted down, trapped by the very methods they once used to trap others. But a few adapted. A few learned. These agents joined emerging authoritarian regimes, hired themselves out as enforcers, or even transitioned into the intelligence services of criminal syndicates. Their skills, manipulation, interrogation, surveillance, remained valuable, even if their ideology did not. In this way, the ISB never fully died. It simply mutated. Echoes in the First Order. Years later, when the First Order rose from the ashes of the Empire, many of its internal security doctrines bore the unmistakable imprint of the ISB. Surveillance drones, loyalty assessments, propaganda dissemination, indoctrination academies the new regime learned from the old, refining its tactics, modernizing its tools, but never forgetting the lessons of fear. Though the First Order had no official ISB, the spirit of the Bureau lived on, in uniforms, in policies, in the cold silence of its agents. Some say former ISB officers helped lay the foundation for the First Order's Security Bureau. Others claim the ISB never truly ended, that it simply went underground, waiting for the day when order would rise again. In either case, the galaxy learned a hard lesson. Tyranny does not vanish when the tyrant falls. It lingers, it adapts. Lipwatches, Chapter 10, Legacy of Fear. The ISB's impact on the galaxy. When the last Imperial banner fell and the stormtroopers surrendered their rifles, the galaxy did not erupt in cheers. It sighed, a long, uncertain exhale after years spent choking on fear. The destruction of the Empire brought freedom, but it also left wounds. Deep, unseen scars etched not by fleets or weapons, but by silence, suspicion, and betrayal. These were the scars left by the ISB. In the aftermath of war, the galaxy began to examine its trauma. It searched for the source of its fear and found not only the Emperor, not only the Death Star, but the bureaucratic, sterile terror of the ISB. A terror that had shaped lives, broken communities, and rewritten the very idea of truth. A legacy of trauma. Entire generations were raised under the eye of the Bureau. Children grew up in classrooms adorned with ISB-approved slogans. Workers learned to smile in every interaction, lest they be accused of ideological subversion. Parents whispered bedtime stories with one ear to the door, fearing the sound of boots. Long after the Empire fell, the psychological effects remained. Survivors of re-education centers reported recurring nightmares, dissociative behavior, and distrust of authority, even in the New Republic. Former informants lived with guilt, former detainees carried shame. Whole planets became haunted by memories of ISB crackdowns. On Lothal, the very mention of the Bureau's name evoked images of midnight raids. On Raxus, artists painted murals of shattered helmets and empty data terminals, symbols of the system that watched them for so long. The terror had ended, but the fear lingered. Citizens without a past. One of the more insidious consequences of the ISB's collapse was the loss of identity. With the Directive 19Z purge of loyalty dossiers, millions of citizens were suddenly rendered data orphans. Without files, they had no proof of innocence or guilt. Some rejoiced, relieved to be free of digital chains. Others suffered. Refugees and displaced persons struggled to prove who they were. Former prisoners found their records wiped, making legal restitution nearly impossible. Trials collapsed without evidence. Justice became elusive. For years, the New Republic debated how to reconstruct this data ethically, how to balance the need for truth with the danger of reviving the very systems they had destroyed. The answer, for many, was to let the silence stand. The rebirth of trust. Restoring trust in government after the fall of the Empire proved far more difficult than any military reconstruction. The ISB had poisoned the well. It had taught citizens to expect lies, to suspect kindness, and to see information as a weapon. To combat this, the New Republic initiated transparency programs. Local councils replaced governors, community meetings replaced directives, civilian oversight committees were established to ensure no surveillance apparatus would ever grow unchecked again. But these efforts moved slowly. In some regions, paranoia remained deeply embedded. Whole communities refused to connect to HoloNet services, fearing new eyes. Families avoided public conversations. The Empire was gone, but its echo was loud, and it often sounded like the clipped boots of an ISB agent walking down a corridor. From tyranny to utility. The most uncomfortable truth about the ISB's legacy is this: its tools worked. Surveillance, psychological profiling, population modeling, these systems, when stripped of cruelty, held value. Law enforcement, intelligence, diplomacy, all could benefit. And so they were adapted. The New Republic, though wary, began using former ISB algorithms to predict organized crime patterns. Local sectors retained portions of the ISB's planetary alert system, redesigned with transparency in mind. Even in education, aspects of loyalty conditioning were reworked into civic education modules. This sparked debate. Was it ethical to use the tools of oppression for peace? Could systems built on fear be restructured into mechanisms of security? There were no easy answers, but one fact remained clear. The galaxy could not forget the ISB, because it had already become a part of it. The return of shadows. Years after the war, in the far reaches of the galaxy, rumors stirred. Whispers of masked agents operating without insignia. Disappearances in sectors far from Coruscant. A man in a white coat, asking questions no one wanted to answer. Some believed remnants of the ISB had survived, not just physically but ideologically, that deep within warlord enclaves and First Order facilities, the Bureau's playbook lived on. When the First Order emerged, its focus on absolute control, propaganda, and civilian loyalty bore undeniable similarities to ISB doctrine. While no official records connected them, many suspected that former ISB officers had helped architect the Order's intelligence apparatus. If true, then the ISB had not died, it had evolved. And the galaxy once again was being watched. Lessons in fear. The tale of the ISB is not just a cautionary story. It is a warning etched in data and blood, a reminder that the tools of peace can become instruments of tyranny when wielded without conscience. It is a reminder that loyalty enforced through fear is not loyalty at all. It is a lesson that surveillance, when unchecked, becomes a prison of the soul. And it is a plea from the past to the future that order must never come at the cost of truth. Epilogue. The final file. In the New Republic archives on Hana City, in a locked vault lies a battered, unmarked datapad. Its contents remain classified, but those who have seen it say it holds one final report. An unfinished ISB briefing never transmitted. Its title is simple: Order through obedience, the price of control. The final line reads, "We have shaped a galaxy in our image, but who will shape us?" The screen flickers, the file ends. And in that silence, the galaxy listens.